delirante.
Delirious. Yesterday, the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, appeared truly euphoric, elated. Joining him in his jubilation were the European leaders, while Western media, for their part, once again headlined the arrival of a miracle weapon. Yet another miracle weapon. A game-changer against the evil Putin. And all this, why? Because yesterday, the lame duck Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, announced from Sweden the acquisition of 150 Swedish Saab Gripen fighter jets for the battered Ukrainian armed forces. More precisely, for the Ukrainian Air Force. However, in reality, all of this represents a total and absolute fiction. A huge scandal once again financed by European taxpayers. Today, in this broadcast, we present the delusion of the 150 Swedish fighter jets for Ukraine, as well as the latest geopolitical developments on a global scale, including the cancellation of the long-awaited meeting between. Thank you for joining us, and please remember to help us fight censorship by giving a thumbs up, hitting the share button, and of course through our social networks, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Let's begin, demolishers, with the main topic of this broadcast. Here are yesterday's images released by Zelensky himself in Sweden. Here, in the town that hosts the Saab fighter jet factory, known as Linkoping, about 200 kilometers from Stockholm, he landed directly at the airport with military honors, including a military band. The Swedish Prime Minister himself, Ulf Kristersson, was waiting for Zelensky's arrival at the Linkoping city airport, 200 kilometers from Stockholm, home to the Saab fighter jet factory, manufacturer of the Gripen. And there, without a prior stop in France, Stockholm or Gothenburg, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky disembarked, creating suspense with his entrance. How long, dear Volodymyr? Now then, with a drum roll, what a farce, honestly. Hurry up, Bolivar, we want to present the scandal. Well, a little further ahead, obviously. Now yes, there's the arrival. Volodymyr there, sorry. Volodymyr, standing there on the right, in front of his plane, to the right of Kristersson, the Swedish Prime Minister for not too long now, Ulf Kristersson. This is his arrival, these are the released images, and right from there, once again, the military band. More footage from the moment of arrival, and immediately after that, the two of them together, heading to the Gripen aircraft factory.
And there they go, here, the factory in question.
And here, at this moment, both of them are going to witness a demonstration of the Saab Gripen, this aircraft, a personalized demonstration prepared for the event. There, the Saab Gripen. More footage of what happened here yesterday, all of that. There's the Gripen doing some spins, stunts, acrobatics. And now comes the more serious moment, the signing of this historic agreement between Ukraine and Sweden. And of course, good old Volodymyr had a little try, naturally. Yes, there's Zelensky sitting there. In one of the versions of the subclip, there's the E version, also known as NG, Next Generation, with a single pilot, single-seater, unlike other two-seater versions. Then they also toured the facilities with the production of other weapons, photos, selfies, lots of laughter. Well, here, this is one of the reconnaissance aircraft, also Saab, supposedly part of this agreement. Well, in Western media, by the way, and even in Spanish-language media, like here, they presented this as a miracle weapon, as a historic agreement, literally. Pay attention to Infobuy's version from yesterday. Ukraine and Sweden sealed a historic agreement for the sale of more than 100 Gripen fighter jets. Pay attention to that, 100 fighters. Gripen of the 4++ or 4.5 generation. This is an aircraft that is more or less comparable, in terms of its features and its age, in some ways as well, to the F-16, to France's Dassault Rafale, the US F-16, and the European Union's Eurofighter Typhoon. What else? From Russia, perhaps the MiG-35, although the MiG-35 is actually more advanced than this aircraft, the Chinese J-10, the South Korean Boramae. Well, one of the most modern aircraft before the fifth generation, with stealth features. And the agreement was presented by the media as a historic deal. Here, in the subtitle, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson signed in Sweden a preliminary agreement for Kiev to acquire up to 150 Gripen fighter jets manufactured by Saab. Well, here we go again. The smaller the text, the more signs of this fiction, this scandal. Now suddenly, it's no longer an agreement, but a preliminary agreement. The images, there, in front of a brand new Gripen, still 0 kilometers. The images of them, looking very nice, signing that preliminary agreement. First sign of this fiction, this scandal. The Swedish government, this is its official website. Sweden and Ukraine deepen cooperation in the field of Air Force, also with great fanfare. But well, cooperation, right? From historic agreement to preliminary agreement to cooperation. Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson and President Volodymyr Zelensky signed a letter of intent. Whoa! From agreement to preliminary agreement to letter of intent on cooperation in the field of air capabilities. This letter of intent between Sweden and Ukraine is the first step toward a possible large-scale export agreement. Well, things take on a different tone here. Still, the Swedish government's website is quite triumphant. More Western media, in this case military outlets, are ecstatic about the news. Here, TWZ, a publication, well, originally in English, translated by the browser, a specialized military publication. Ukraine suddenly signs a letter of intent for a huge order of Gripen fighter jets. Sweden and Ukraine have unveiled a plan to deliver up to not 150 fighters, but up to 150 Gripen jets to the war-torn country. But there are still major questions left unanswered. According to this outlet, a specialized military outlet, so a bit more serious, they mention the huge number of unanswered questions. Zelensky, always with his 20-centimeter high platforms. Hear how nice, Zelensky getting on the plane. He couldn't miss the opportunity. This is the post, by the way, from the Swedish embassy. Here they even have memes made down here, for example. Well, here, for instance, Sweden in Ukraine. There's the Swedish embassy in Ukraine, and a Gripen with the Ukrainian emblem, and inside a little dog. Even memes. Well, that's politics. Today's geopolitics. More interested in social media than in reality. And here's another outlet presenting this as a major breakthrough. This post includes technical information. The performance and armament of the Gripen, the excellent Swedish fighter jet that Ukraine wants, right? Dispersed operations, the Swedish jet's advantage in case of an attack on its bases, the spectacular and fiery display of a Gripen fighter. This one, the latest version, the JAS-39C of the Czech Air Force. Well, this aircraft, so far, in technical terms, I would describe as a respectable one, no doubt, although it's had some little issues throughout its development and even afterward. If I remember correctly, the first flight took place in 1988. Yes, my friends, that's how old this aircraft is. It's a plane whose development took place in the 1980s. In 1988, they carried out the first flight. In 96, it entered service in Sweden, naturally. And since then, it has been involved in multiple incidents, had issues with its avionics guidance, its radar system, and some incidents, if I'm not mistaken, one even fatal, resulting in the death of a pilot. Well, that's how modern airplanes are. Beyond that, it's a respectable aircraft, and in fact already in service in several countries, thanks to quite a significant commercial success, mainly because its price is a bit lower than that of American planes, though not as low as the Russian ones, of course. But above all, because many countries want fighter jets that are compatible with NATO's regulatory and technical framework, without having to buy American aircraft and deal with all the connotations that come with acquiring a plane from that country. Political pressure, conditions, and in short, 1,000 things tied to American planes. That's why the Czech Republic has aircraft of this kind. Hungary also purchased these planes some time ago. Some went to Thailand, others to South Africa. The last buyer, if I remember correctly, was Brazil, during Lula's government. Not this one, but the previous one. Finally, the delivery, if I'm not mistaken, was a purchase made under Lula and delivered during Bolsonaro's government. Apparently, Colombia wants to sign for some aircraft, but of course, like all Western suppliers, they have significant delays in delivering these fighter jets. They're facing delays of years, right? This is the concrete situation. And by the way, regarding this, here begins the revelation of the scandal, in the very words of the Swedish Prime Minister. At the same event, when he was asked about the delivery period for this order, yes, agreement, preliminary agreement, letter of intent, purchase order. So, when is the actual delivery? That's the question. Knowing precisely about the delays in the delivery of these aircraft, beyond any technical difficulties, once again. And here, the Swedish Prime Minister is going to respond as follows. Attention.
A process, so this is a long period of...
Well, this is a long-term period, Ulf replies. We're talking more or less about the delivery of the first Saab Gripen NGR fighter, next generation, also known as the Gripen E, because it's the 5th development version of this aircraft, after the A, B, C, D, and E. Well, we're thinking, Chris Turson responds, about 3 years for the delivery of the first Gripen, the first new Gripen. Again, for the delivery of the first one, number 1, in 3 years, right? According to the statement made by the Swedish Prime Minister himself that same day, what the media presented shows the cognitive divergence, the disconnection from reality between the daily media propaganda and the actual facts. So, what did this man say? The first one, in 3 years. And what do the media publish? Historic agreement for the immediate acquisition of 150 aircraft.
Delivery that's possible, as I said. And I'm saying that, I'm not saying,
I want to emphasize that this is not done here and now, quickly. No, it's true. We do indeed support him in his words in this case. And a little more from Chris Torson.
And this is how all major projects start, in fact, to be honest. I mean,
but we are showing here our long-term commitment. And this is the way all projects, well, yes, indeed, this is how they start. With the signing of a letter of intent, with the signing of an order. But guys, in 3 years, the first one. Later, the Swedish media presented the unconfirmed version of a 10-year agreement. 10 years for the acquisition of these 150 fighter jets. That alone is laughable, by the way, because in 10 years, Ukraine might no longer exist. In fact, Ukraine might disappear within 3 years as well. But the most delirious and funniest part of all is that they appear in the calculation of the costs and production of this. By the way, taken from a very, very serious Russian aviation blogger, who presented it like this, while we accompany the analysis with some of the images. That's always nice, the fighters flying. Well, as a reference, let's begin the analysis of this situation. What's the unit cost of each of these little planes? Well, second-hand, used. Yes, at least $50 million per unit. $50 million per unit. Now then, a new one, as they want in this case, has a value between $85 and $150 million per unit for each of these fighters.
unidad, por cada uno de estos cazas. Si acompañamos esa cifra de
If we take that cost figure, in a way turnkey, but without many of the fundamental aspects of a combat aircraft, such as service, maintenance, training, and so on, if, of course, we add the cost of a new one with repairs, pilot training, education, and maintenance, each unit comes to a value of $200 million. Naturally, multiplying 50 million per unit in the case of used ones, but for new ones, with training, maintenance, and service, well, depending on whether they're used or new, the total figure amounts to between $5 and $22 billion. In this case, at least in the media, the version about new planes was the one being reported. That's why the Swedish Prime Minister referred to the delivery of the first one, eventually, not even confirmed, within 3 years. But then, within that range, we're talking about between $5 and $22 billion in a country like Ukraine, not only already deeply in debt, but also with an annual budget that, for example, this year totals around $55 billion in revenue, including donations and so on. For this year, 2025, Ukraine's own budget is around $55 billion. So for this supposed 10-year fantasy, if they want those 150 new fighter jets in 10 years, during which Ukraine itself could disappear, what will almost certainly disappear here is the money, coming from somewhere. According to the agreement, or at least the letter of intent for European funding, from us, the European taxpayers, whether we are European citizens or residents in Europe, making the corresponding contributions, paying taxes month after month. Well, if the Ukrainian budget actually amounts to $55 billion, then Ukraine would have to cut practically half of its entire annual budget to buy these little planes. From a country already destroyed, with its electrical infrastructure, its industrial infrastructure, its gas infrastructure, energy, heating, industry, destroyed and increasingly destroyed in the process of destruction. Its economically active population is completely depleted, not only because of the number of Ukrainians killed as a result of the war, but also because of the massive exodus of Ukrainians, and now not only men, but also women and children of all ages. Logically, despite that disaster, with a staggering debt exceeding 100% of its annual output, well, that should lead to cutting in half the budget of that failed state, just to buy this. That's the level of delusion presented by Western media as a miracle weapon, as a game changer. Once again, devastating, yet another so-called miracle weapon. After the Leopard tanks, the Abrams tanks, the British tanks. Do you remember the case of the British tanks buried in the mud up to the turret? We even showed it here a year ago in a propaganda video, a preview made by the British outlet The Sun, with a journalist riding on top of a tank crossing the steps during a training exercise as a show of force. And suddenly, the tank got stuck in the mud, and they couldn't get it out. They couldn't remove it from there, not even after several hours of work pushing with another tank. Well, that's the level of delusion, one miracle weapon after another. Well, the ATACMS, you'll remember them, the French Scalp missiles. The Storm Shadows. What else? You'll help me remember. The F-16s. At one point, the Mirage 2000s, planes from the 1970s, almost none still in operation. Well, all miracle weapons. The new one. This one here. The new miracle weapon. This one. But also, the production of this aircraft. And by the way, once again, all this analysis thanks to a Russian blogger known as, his analyses are in Russian but translatable, on Telegram, on the name of that channel. If I'm not mistaken, for those interested, well, I can't recall it right now. Something Bombardero in English. Anyway, how many planes did Sweden produce? What production did Sweden achieve since the start of production about 20 years ago? Actually, earlier, because the first flight was in 1988, and it entered service in 1996, so more than 20 years.
En servicio en 1996, con lo cual más de 20 años. Pero bueno, de los últimos 20 años, redondeando...
Anyway, over the last 20 years, roughly speaking, how many Gripens has the Swedish industry produced? What output have they achieved? 200 or 300 Gripens in 20 years, for Sweden so far. And for the previously mentioned countries, just a few. A small fleet in Hungary, in the Czech Republic if I remember correctly, also in Thailand. A small squadron, and in Brazil, the few purchased by that country. If I'm not mistaken, the Czech Republic, Hungary, South Africa, Thailand, Brazil. And apparently Petro also wants some of these planes, those not yet produced, of course, which means they're on a waiting list, and that's before Ukraine. But so far, specifically produced, about 300 over 20 years. Which means, according to their own figures, in this delusion, over the next 10 years, Saab in Sweden would have to undertake aircraft production exclusively for Ukraine.
Exclusivamente para Ucrania. Máquinas al 100%, tiempo completo de ocupación.
Machines running at 100%, full-time use of both machines and operators, so that in 10 years they can produce the 150 aircraft required by Ukraine. If they managed 300 in 20 years, they can do another 150 in 10. From now on, the next 10 years would be dedicated solely to manufacturing for Ukraine, not for the Swedish armed forces, which also have pending orders. Well, in Colombia's case, even less so, and other orders from elsewhere, none of that. Madness in terms of costs, madness in terms of Ukraine's credit capacity, Ukraine's economic capacity, madness in production, absolute madness in every respect.
Delirio absolutamente por todos lados, ¿sí? Una operación de prensa burda, barata.
A crude, cheap media operation, but reproduced by all the outlets in the world, with those beautiful images of Zelensky there, watching this show, apparently that of a Czech Gripen from the Czech Air Force, and then, of course, getting on the little toy himself, right? Alright, let's wrap up this topic here and move on to the next one, speaking of little toys. This, by the way, was also published yesterday. Who wouldn't take the chance for a little ride in one of these toys, instead of taking part in the duties and responsibilities of the Minister of Defense, or rather, now the Minister of War, of a country? The Secretary of War, good old Pete Hegseth, also known as a Fox host turned minister, now the US Secretary of War.
Devenido en ministro en secretario de guerra de Estados Unidos, el día de ayer presentaba esto.
Yesterday I showed this here, which is quite amusing. The little sign of the Honourable Pete Hegseth, Secretary of War, in this video released yesterday, of course, on his social media. Good old Pete at the most famous pilot academy in the world, thanks to that blockbuster from the 1980s starring Tom Cruise, which recently had a sequel, last year, or the year before. He's older now, but it was fun and entertaining as an action movie, obviously. Top Gun. The old and beloved movie, Top Gun, with spectacular music. Well, Pete Hegseth yesterday shared this video of his visit to Top Gun. Actually, the official name is the United States Navy Fighter Weapons School, the US Navy's fighter training school. And here's Pete even flying in a plane made just for him. Pete Hegseth, and above it said, Second Air. Well, no idea if that's possibly the official name or the official initials.
Ese posiblemente el nombre oficial, las oficiales iniciales. Un parche hecho
A patch made just for him, painted especially.
solamente para él, pintadito especialmente. Bueno, y él relatando aquí algo.
Well, and he's telling something here. For 250 years, Americans have taken part in this project beyond themselves, in the name of a common interest. Well, a lot of things said. The 250 years part, maybe because of the Navy, probably that's it. The US Navy is surely 250 years old. The Air Force isn't, obviously. 250 years ago, humans still didn't have airplanes. And there's Pete Hegseth up there. That's an F-18, right? An F-18. Up there with his kids, his wife. And that, the famous control tower, with that movie scene when, of course, as you know, only seen in bits when people recall it, that funny scene when the rebel pilot Maverick, if I remember correctly, that's what they called him in Top Gun, did a low pass over the control tower, despite the tower's refusal, and the controller spilling coffee on his shirt, something silly like that. And there's his family welcoming him. How nice. How lovely.
Qué lindo, sí, qué bonito. Bueno, ahí bajando. Bueno, bien que por lo menos.
We're coming down there. All right, at least no vomiting, no sickness, because obviously he didn't do any very radical maneuvers. He's there with his little helmet. Well, a bit of silliness. If they present them on the official pages of the White House and the Department of War, how could we not show it here as a transition to our next topic? Now, seriously, many thanks to JC Machine World for the greetings. Trump, from the White House, also yesterday, in a meeting with Mark Rutte, the former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, now serving as Secretary General of the UN. Here are yesterday's statements, and some of them are very, very important. Let's start with this one.
Aquí comenzamos. Ahora sí.
Here we go. Well, Trump starts here at the White House.
Comienza Trump aquí en la Casa Blanca. Como ustedes saben, la semana próxima vamos a...
As you know, next week we're going to travel to Malaysia, South Korea, and Japan. In South Korea, I'm supposed to meet with President Xi of China. This, in fact, hasn't been confirmed by the Chinese authorities. Actually, today I read a report saying the opposite. Why this meeting with Xi Jinping? The Chinese president would be in South Korea for the annual meeting of the ASEAN heads of state. This week, in South Korea, China is logically participating in ASEAN. But as far as I know, Xi Jinping is not going to attend that meeting. At least that's the version so far. Maybe at the last minute they'll reach an agreement. But well, Trump is already presenting it as a certainty. But since he's such a liar and so, let's call him imaginative, not to say fanciful, well, he's already presenting that as a sure thing. Anyway, we're going to discuss very important matters and several of our pending issues with them. We're waiting for it.
Varias de nuestras cuestiones pendientes con ello, estamos esperándolo. Y ahora sí, el anuncio más importante de...
And now, yes, the most important announcement of this part of the press conference. But, on the other hand, we cancelled the meeting with Putin. Here once again.
Una vez más.
Look forward to that. I think something will work out. We have a very good relationship.
Now there.
The meeting with President Putin,
We canceled the meeting. Cancelamos el encuentro con el presidente.
We cancelled the meeting with President Putin. It didn't feel right to me. I didn't think we were going to reach the point we should reach.
But we'll do it in the future. But next week we'll be with many of you in those locations.
But we'll do it in the future. And next week, we'll be with you in those 3 destinations.
Can you tell us a little bit about why you're elevating sanctions against Russia right now?
Y aquí otro de sus anuncios, presidente, porque
And here's another one of his announcements, Mr. President, because just minutes before this press conference, he enacted sanctions against the most important Russian oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. And that's why the question here, minutes after the decision was confirmed, was going to prompt Trump to respond as follows. I just felt it was the right time, after waiting a long time.
Sentí que era el tiempo correcto después de haber esperado mucho. Muy profunda la respuesta, por cierto.
Very deep answer, by the way.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Bueno,
Well, Mr. President, you also said yesterday that you still believe Putin wants to end the war and that you're going to impose these sanctions to create more pressure. What other things are you going to do in this regard to put pressure on Putin and end the war? Well, what we're doing today is very important. These are tremendous sanctions against his 2 most important oil companies.
Everything else that we're looking at, but we don't think that's going to be necessary.
Y esperamos que la presión sobre estas empresas haga.
And we hope that the pressure on these companies will bring the war to an end. We hope that the delivery of missiles will not be necessary. We would like to see them accept the dividing line of the battlefront that has formed over several years of fighting. By the way, we're sharing greetings and super chats here. Thank you very much, Analí Díaz García Peña. Thank you so much. And here's Waldo Quijada, who always joins us. Greetings to Ezequiel Bistoletti from Temuco, Chile. Great work. 1,000 thanks, Waldo. And once again, here's Waldo again. Well, the important thing here at the end of this statement, we hope, these are Trump's exact words, that they accept the freeze along the current line of combat.
El congelamiento en la línea de combate actual. De hecho, esta, por cierto, la razón.
In fact, this was, by the way, the reason for the so-called cancellation, in quotes, of this meeting after the agreement between both leaders. Following the call a day before the meeting between Trump and Zelensky at the White House, they decided, you'll remember, to hold a meeting in Hungary. But shortly afterward, when the respective foreign ministers, Lavrov on the Russian side and Marco Rubio, and Narco, not by mistake, but because that's how he was referred to, on the US side as Secretary of Foreign Affairs, began the preliminary phone conversation to arrange the details. Marco Rubio suddenly wanted, once again, obviously at the president's request, to include an agreement for a ceasefire, a halt to hostilities along the current line of conflict, the current line of contact. To which Lavrov responded with the same answer he's been giving for at least 3 years, the same Russian position since the beginning of the war, the same response Putin has given from the start, and that all Russian officials continue to give.
Desde el principio, lo que responden todos los funcionarios rusos. Si quieren el comienzo de negociaciones, entonces deben.
If they want the start of negotiations, then the Ukrainian armed forces, must abandon the Donbass. Well, obviously Zelensky doesn't want this, because that's where his last defensive forces are, his last fortified positions. If the Donbass is abandoned and negotiations then begin, they will not only have to later capitulate, regarding the surrender of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, logically, but also, if the Russians wish, though they might not, they could carry out a deep advance against a completely disarmed Ukraine. Because the major fortified positions, the major defensive positions built from 2014 onward, for more than 10 years, well, remain in the Donbass. Most of them already taken, destroyed, conquered, captured by Russia, but still some in the Donbass under attack, though not yet taken by the Russians.
Bajo ataque, pero aún no tomadas por los rusos, por eso la negativa de Zelensky y el apoyo de Zelensky a esta propuesta.
That's why Zelensky's refusal and his support for this proposal are obviously in favor of Ukraine, not abandoning the strongest defensive positions and rebuilding its battered armed forces, both in terms of personnel and in the technical, material, and resource aspects. On the other hand, Trump, no fool himself, in these back-and-forth exchanges, left no room for double meaning regarding the Tomahawk missiles. And here he responded immediately afterward to the issue of the Tomahawk missiles.
Attention over here.
Yeah, fake. Wall Street Journal.
Mr. President Trump, there are rumors circulating, started by a Washington Post article, claiming that you had approved the delivery of Tomahawk missiles and also deep strikes against Russia. And Trump now responds as follows. This news is fake, a lie, and the Washington Post is fake, it's a lie. Less dishonest about financial matters, that's often the Washington Post's focus, the financial angle of its reporting. On that point, Trump has no issue with their editorial line, but regarding everything else, according to Trump, the Washington Post is fake. And here Trump responds a bit more. That story, Mr. President, says the reporter, says that you lifted the restrictions. And Trump replies, no. The story actually says that I authorized missile strikes deep inside Russia, and I did not authorize that. And secondly, they're not using our missiles for the attacks, but rather European missiles, or ones from somewhere else.
They're not using ours, and what they do, I don't control that. But I do control.
And I don't control that, obviously, but I do control our missiles.
They're not shooting our missiles, and it was a fake story. Wall Street Journal.
And they're not going to fire our missiles at Russia. It was a false story, a fictional story, fake. The Washington Post makes a lot of false stories, fake, as they call them, in English. And later on, he's going to explain why the Tomahawk missiles weren't delivered to the Ukrainians, once again.
Tomahawk a los ucranianos una vez más. Abandona la reunión
He leaves the meeting because, in that meeting, once again, Russia would have presented its demands, the withdrawal of the Ukrainian armed forces from the Donbass, as a condition for negotiations. This comes from a position of strength, due to Russia's daily advances and the growing destruction of essential and strategic Ukrainian infrastructure over the past 2 weeks, at a dizzying pace. There are more attacks every day. As we reported yesterday, in September, the number of attacks reached a record high, with 5,500 drones that month, surpassing the previous record of 4,400 drones launched in August of this year, just a month earlier. And so surely, in October, by the 31st, they will count even more. We will count more than 5,500 drones launched against Ukraine, destroying power plants, hydroelectric plants, thermal plants, gas infrastructure, oil infrastructure, railway hubs, heating infrastructure, and so on. On one hand, then, Trump abandons this possibility of an agreement in the face of Russia's strong position. But on the other hand, he also does not want a strong provocation against Russia with the Tomahawks.
Fuerte contra Rusia con los Tomahawk. Esta, en cierta medida, la estrategia de Trump de...
This is, to some extent, Trump's strategy of ambivalence. In international relations, this is called strategic ambivalence. For example, in the case of US foreign policy toward Taiwan, they say, yes, we support the One China policy, but then they sponsor Taiwanese independence advocates. Yes and no, in a way that avoids creating a clear position for any of the actors, while they slowly carry out their foreign policy. In this case, the weakening of Russia, but at the same time, with Trump, also a strategic pullback in Europe, and the delegation of this burden, because the war is already lost, to the European countries. Hear Trump on the reasons for his decision regarding the Tomahawks.
Go ahead.
Attention, please. Well, the problem with the Tomahawks is that many people don't know this. It takes at least 6 months, usually a year, to learn how to use them. President, why did you decide not to deliver Tomahawks? And Trump replies, the problem with the Tomahawks, and it's something very few people may know, is that it would take 6 months to deliver them, and to learn how to use these missiles. So this process would be very complicated, and the only way to fire Tomahawk missiles right now would be if we fired them ourselves.
And we're not going to do that. But
Trump's confession here, and we're not going to do that.
it's a very powerful weapon, very accurate.
There's a very steep learning curve. It's an incredibly powerful weapon, very
Weapon, and maybe that
very precise.
it takes a year of intense training to learn how to.
Y por eso, lo difícil.
And that's why it's difficult to handle. That's why it's complex to use. It would take a year for the Ukrainians to learn to operate it. A while ago, it was 6 months. Now a year. Well, and we're not going to teach them how to use it. That would be too bold a move regarding the future. What's interesting here is Trump's admission that indeed the Tomahawk missiles, if delivered, couldn't end up in Ukrainian hands, but rather the Americans themselves would have to carry out the operation. They shouldn't just determine the targets using US intelligence already provided. They should first present the satellite images, then determine the targets, then carry out the operation, and finally complete the mission. All of that is in American hands, just like with the British Storm Shadow missiles, with the entire procedure carried out by the British, and the Scalp missiles in the case of the French, who are already openly participating through this action. This operation with these missiles, nowadays, they've become irrelevant. None are being fired anymore, and the last ones launched were all intercepted. But well, Trump doesn't want any trouble in that regard. And here, maybe the last part of yesterday's press conference. In the meantime, as always, we call on our supporters to give us a thumbs up, because that helps us fight censorship. Share, thumbs up, notification bell. If you can support us with a membership or through PayPal, that's also very welcome, of course. But just sharing is more than enough for us. That's super important. And please, give us a thumbs up. And here, credit to a journalist, a somewhat critical journalist. For the first time, someone asked a slightly critical question directed at Mark Rutte. An awkward situation. An awkward situation for Mark Rutte because of this question here.
I'm not going to comment on
Nations and Canada
A little further ahead.
band together. They are neither am I.
Over here. Over here, over here.
Shows a massive collapse in Ukraine.
Mi pregunta es para el secretario general de la OTAN, Mark Rutte.
My question is for the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte. I don't know if you've seen the polls conducted by the American pollster Gallup in recent days, which show that support for the war among Ukrainian society has dropped dramatically, with only 23% of the Ukrainian population supporting the continuation of the conflict.
La población ucraniana apoyando la continuidad de la guerra.
Less than a quarter. Zelensky came out today praising President Trump's proposal for freezing the front lines of battle as part of a ceasefire. He said that's a good compromise. So people view your coming here.
El propio Zelensky dijo que un alto el fuego sería bueno.
Zelensky himself said that a ceasefire would be good along the current front line, but people see that his visit here to the White House to convince the US government to continue the war is actually in favor of precisely the continuation of the conflict. You are suggesting more weapons.
De la guerra. Usted está sugiriendo más armas.
The Ukrainians themselves no longer want to fight this war.
Los ucranianos ya no quieren pelear esta guerra.
Well, I'm lobbying.
Entonces, ¿cómo justifica eso?
So, how does he justify that? Well, a logical question. If they really want the end of the war, and that's everyone's rhetoric, then why do they want more weapons, more soldiers, and the continuation of the conflict until the last Ukrainian? This is the question for Mark Rutte, and now he's in a tight spot.
Only for one thing, and that is to make sure that we end this war. And I don't
Well, I'm here simply because I want the war to end.
Bueno, yo estoy aquí simplemente porque quiero terminar la guerra.
What a nerve.
everything he could do to bring.
Y esto es lo que quiere el presidente.
And this is what the president wants. So I don't have to advise him, because he wants to end the war. President Trump.
And the fact that the US is now supplying.
Es crucial que
It's crucial to promote dialogue with Putin, with Zelensky, which until recently he refused. This man, until Trump's arrival, refused contact, not just dialogue, but any contact with Russia directly, just like all of European and US diplomacy, which until Trump's arrival had directly rejected communication. They rejected it as if it were communication with Hitler, with the enemy himself, the devil himself. But anyway, respond a bit more, Rutte, over here.
Pero bueno, responde un poquito más. Rutte por aquí.
Weapons into Ukraine, paid for by allies, is extremely important, and that's now happening since 2-3 months. About 2 billion moving into Ukraine.
Why do you think that'll wind it down now?
What do you mean?
You think more weapons will wind down the war?
Pero entonces, señor Rutte.
But then, Mr. Rutte, the journalist's question is the following. According to you, do you believe that sending more weapons will end the war? Because that's your argument.
Sí, porque es el argumento de él. Queremos el final de la guerra, por eso queremos más armas para.
We want the war to end. That's why we're asking for more weapons to put pressure on Putin.
The president said this weekend, stop where you are, so basically do a ceasefire and then have.
Y entonces responde Rutte, bueno, no, pero hay que.
And then Rutte replies, well, no, but we need to do more things, as Trump said over the weekend. We have to discuss territorial issues as well. But the first thing is a ceasefire.
También, pero lo primero es un alto el
This is
fuego.
what you said on Friday and on Sunday.
It's a war. I mean, your question's really a fair one. It's a war that should have never started.
Y ahí metido Trump en el medio.
And there, with Trump in the middle, your question is a fair question, an appropriate question. This is a war that should never have started. But you know how I feel.
Pero tú sabes cómo me siento, esta guerra no debería haber comenzado
We're
nunca.
not selling any weapons to Ukraine.
This war should never have started. And we, the Americans, are not selling any weapons to Ukraine, but to NATO, which is different from what Biden was doing.
NATO, and in theory, you can do what you want with them.
No es lo que hacía Biden, que les regaló 300.000.
It's not what Biden did, who gave them $300 billion in money and weapons, but ultimately, we sell weapons to NATO, and you can do whatever you want. How cynical, Trump. For God's sake, you, NATO, can do whatever you want. The shameless Trump basically answers, yes, the fair question. There's no way that sending more weapons will bring an end to the war. Quite the opposite. But remember, Trump, we don't ship weapons for war. We trade weapons, right? Call the people at NATO, the protests, the lawsuits, the people at NATO. Very cynical. Not only because the United States leads NATO, but also because sending weapons to NATO obviously implies sending weapons to Ukraine. In any case, they just pass through different hands until they reach Ukraine, until they reach the hands of the Ukrainian armed forces. Of course, the more hands in between, the bigger the bribes, the bigger the commissions, the greater the corruption. Yes.
La corrupción, ¿sí? Bueno, bien por este periodista por
Well, good for this journalist. For first, well, we want more weapons because we want them for Ukraine's defense, like the Patriots.
Queremos más armas porque las queremos para la defensa de Ucrania, como los Patriots. Bueno, mentira, quieren sí, también quieren armas defensivas.
Well, that's not true. They do want defensive weapons, yes, but obviously they also want offensive weapons, and that's why they want the Tomahawk missile. They don't want the Tomahawk as an interceptor missile, but as a missile for a deep strike into Russian territory, even against Moscow. So, well, Rutte is in trouble, unable to truly answer this question. The first criticism within the framework of White House press conferences since Trump's arrival, not directed at Trump, obviously, but at least at Mark Rutte. All right, folks, how are we on time? Can we show something else, or are we more or less at the hour?
¿Algo más o ya más o menos en la hora? Bueno, en primer lugar quiero recordar una vez más.
Well, first of all, I want to remind everyone once again that next Tuesday at 7 p.m. at the Pulque Bar on Ontario Street 484 in the Congreso neighborhood of Buenos Aires, very close to the National Congress. By the way, next Tuesday we're going to hold an open and free gathering with the Demolishers, as we've done many times here in Buenos Aires. Over in Madrid, in Colombia, in Bogota, we've also already held 2 gatherings with the Demolishers. Everyone's invited. A short introduction from us, and then a back and forth of questions, answers, and conversations, over coffee, beer, or whatever each person prefers, at the very lovely Pulque Bar over there.
Muy bonito bar Pulque por allí. Cortito sobre el final, podemos...
Briefly before we wrap up, we can present or not, maybe we'll present this tomorrow, because I want to do a more in-depth analysis of the words of a former US Pentagon advisor in an appearance on Australian television. Quite striking, a man named James Carden, who basically confessed on British and Australian TV that Ukraine lost the war. Something very interesting was also said about Ukrainian casualties, for the first time, on Western television, but we can present that tomorrow in greater detail, more calmly. In 40 minutes, Adrian Zelaya's show begins on our sister channel, MP Geopolitica, with a live simulcast here. Please also support us by subscribing to MP Geopolitica, our sister channel.
También con la suscripción a DMP Geopolítica, nuestro canal hermano. Recuerden también acompañar a nuestro canal de Telegram.
Also remember to check out our friendly, or rather brother, Telegram channel, Wars and Geopolitics, an amazing Telegram channel entirely in Spanish. And if you'd like to support us by subscribing to our channel, also free, our English language channel, Demolishing Political Myths in English, the link is below in the description. So that's all. DMP Geopolitics, the DMP channel in English, this one of course as well. And our friends from the Telegram channel, Wars and Geopolitics, for those interested in up-to-the-minute geopolitical information on Telegram. That said, dear Demolishers, Adrian Zelaya, and we will be back here tomorrow. A kiss and a hug. We love you very much, and see you soon. Bye.
Un beso y un abrazo, los queremos mucho y hasta pronto. Chao.
you.